By 1871, the Northern Pacific Railroad was surveying land and building tracks. The railroad reached the western frontier of Dakota Territory in 1872. To protect surveyors and railroad workers, the U.S. government began setting up forts. Between 1858 and 1874, the U.S. Army built 10 forts in northern Dakota Territory. The forts became the home of soldiers and their families. The forts were used only as long as they were needed. Fort Abercrombie State Historic Site, was the first Army fort built in North Dakota. It was constructed on the west bank of the Red River in 1858. It is located about 12 miles north of present-day Wahpeton, North Dakota. During the Dakota War in 1862 in Minnesota, many of the settlers went to Fort Abercrombie for protection. Dakota warriors attacked the fort, which had not been built with a stockade. Soldiers hurriedly put up an 8-foot wall of logs for protection. Messengers from the fort sneaked past the attackers and traveled to Fort Snelling, in present-day Minneapolis, to get help. The fort remained under attack from time to time for about 6 weeks. After a time, the troops ran low on bullets for their rifles. It was discovered that canister shells for a cannon contained pellets that could be used as rifle bullets. The women in the fort took on the responsibility of opening the canisters and getting the pellets ready to use as bullets. When 350 troops arrived from Fort Snelling, the attack stopped. After the siege, a permanent stockade was built around the fort, and blockhouses were placed at 3 corners. Fort Abercrombie was strong enough to withstand any attack, but the fort was never attacked again. Fort Abercrombie was the most westerly Army post of the United States in the early 1860s. It became the gateway to the Red River Valley and all of North Dakota. Furs, provisions, supplies, equipment, and mail went through Fort Abercrombie on the way to and from St. Paul, Minnesota. In 1877, the U.S. Army determined that Fort Abercrombie was no longer needed as an Army post, and it was abandoned. The buildings were sold to settlers in the area. Fort Rice State Historic Site, was built by General Sully's Army in the summer of 1864 to headquarter troops as they were battling Lakota and Dakota Indians in western North Dakota. Fort Rice was located about 30 miles south of present-day Mondon, North Dakota. This fort was the first Army post located on the Missouri River in North Dakota. The buildings at Fort Rice were constructed of cottonwood logs from the trees which grew in abundance along the river. The roofs were made of sod, grass-covered soil. After a time, the wood got dry and shrank, leaving gaps between the logs. Snow and dust blew through the cracks, and rodents, rats and mice, got inside the buildings. When the buildings at Fort Rice crumbled, the entire fort was rebuilt and surrounded by a stockade. The new fort was a quadrangle. The new buildings included sleeping quarters, a hospital, storehouses, a bakery, a library, and a guardhouse. Corrals and stables for the horses were located outside the stockade. In 1878, Fort Rice was no longer needed, and the buildings were taken down. Another Army post, Fort Yates, had been built to take its place. Fort Ransom was constructed in 1867 of oak logs from the Cheyenne River Valley. The fort was built on a site called Grizzly Bear Hill. It was located near the present-day town of Fort Ransom, about 30 miles south of Valley City, North Dakota. The purpose of this fort was to guard the trail from Fort Abercrombie to the Missouri River. The soldiers at Fort Ransom fought against mosquitoes in the summer and bitterly cold weather in the winter. 2 mail carriers traveling between Fort Abercrombie and Fort Ransom froze to death on the trail. Water for drinking and cooking had to be carried from a spring about a third of a mile from the fort. In 1871, the Northern Pacific Railroad began building tracks in northern Dakota Territory. The railroad tracks reached Jamestown in 1872. The U.S. Army decided that it was more important to provide protection for railroad crews than to guard the wagon roads. For this reason, Fort Ransom was closed, and the materials from that fort were used to build Fort Seward at Jamestown. Fort Seward was never very important as a military fort. It closed and was abandoned in 1877. Fort Totten, located on the south side of Devil's Lake, was established in 1867. Its purpose was to enforce the peace, guard overland transportation routes, and aid the Dakota Sioux who lived near Devil's Lake. The buildings at Fort Totten were first built of logs but were replaced by brick structures in 1868. This was the best-built military post in the state, and the brick buildings appear much the same today as when they were originally constructed. In 1890, the U.S. Army discontinued the use of Fort Totten. From 1891 until 1959, it served as a boarding school for Indian children. Fort Buford State Historic Site, was the fort located farthest west in North Dakota. It was built in 1866 near the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers, about 20 miles from present-day Williston, North Dakota. In 1867, the fort was enlarged using materials from the abandoned fur trading post, Fort Union. Because of its location on two major rivers, Fort Buford was a supply station for military posts in Dakota Territory. It also protected railroad workers who were surveying and laying tracks. In 1881, Sitting Bull, the great Lakota leader, surrendered his gun at Fort Buford. The fort was in operation for a total of 29 years. It was abandoned in 1895. The Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes, located along the Missouri and Knife Rivers, had asked the U.S. Army for protection from the Dakota warriors who had been raiding their villages. In 1867, Fort Stephenson was built along the Missouri River to provide this protection. It also served as a middle point for a mail route that extended from Fort Rice to Fort Buford. By 1881, the Dakota tribes had surrendered. Fort Stephenson was abandoned in 1883. The buildings were used as the Fort Berthold Indian School until 1894. The site of Fort Stephenson, near the present-day city of Garrison, North Dakota, is now under the waters of Lake Sacagawea. Fort Pembina was established in 1870 near the confluence of the Red and Pembina rivers in northeastern North Dakota. It was not far from the site of the old Fort Pembina fur trading post. The purposes of this military fort were to protect settlers in the Red River Valley and to help stop illegal trade between Canada and the United States. It was abandoned in 1895 after much of it was destroyed by fire. In 1872, Fort McKean was built about 5 miles south of present-day Mandan at the confluence of the Hart and Missouri rivers. Later that year, its name was changed to Fort Abraham Lincoln. The fort had originally been set up as an infantry post, but in 1873, cavalry was added. A post office also operated at this fort. By 1874, Fort Abraham Lincoln had 3 companies of infantry and 6 companies of cavalry. A army company usually consisted of about 65 men. Fort Abraham Lincoln was the largest army fort in North Dakota. George Armstrong Custer was the first commander at Fort Abraham Lincoln. He commanded the U.S. 7th Cavalry, which was stationed there. George Custer and his wife Elizabeth Custer, nicknamed Libby, enjoyed the fine things that went along with being in charge of an army post. The commander's house at Fort Abraham Lincoln was very large and fancy. It had a bathroom, expensive carpets and drapes, and fine furniture. Custer had fought in the Civil War in the 1860s and had been given the temporary rank of general at that time. After the Civil War, he was placed back at his regular rank of lieutenant, colonel, a lower rank than a general. At the time he commanded the 7th Cavalry, he was not a general, but a lieutenant colonel. The Lakota people were angry about treaties being broken and their lands being taken over by settlers and gold seekers. The Lakota people were made up of several bands that were related to the Dakota Nation. Indians were forced to live on reservations. Provisions promised to them were often not available. In 1876, Lakota leaders Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Rain in the Face, and Gull led a large band of Lakota to Montana to hunt bison and celebrate a summer feast. The U.S. government ordered the Indians to return to their reservations, but they ignored this order. The U.S. Army sent troops to Montana to help bring the Lakota people back to the reservations. On May 17, 1876, the band played while Custer and his 7th Cavalry paraded around Fort Abraham Lincoln. Then they started off for Montana. Libby Custer and other officers' wives rode with the troops part of the first day. When they stopped to say their goodbyes, the band played a popular song of the day, "The Girl I Left Behind Me." The generals in charge of the operation in Montana decided to come at the Indians from 3 directions, surround them, and force them to surrender. Custer's unit and 2 other units split up. Scouts who were sent ahead came back and reported to Custer that there were huge numbers of Indians camped beside the Little Bighorn River. The Lakotas called this river the Greasy Grass. Custer did not believe that there could be so many. He decided to go ahead and attack without waiting for the 2 other units. Custer's decision to attack led to disaster. In the battle, now called the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Lieutenant Colonel Custer and his entire command, all of the soldiers, were killed. The other units also failed to defeat the Lakotas and their Cheyenne Indian allies, friends. Though the Lakota Indians had defeated the U.S. Army in this important battle, they knew more soldiers would come after them. They left the Greasy Grass River. Several bands traveled all the way to Canada where they were safe from the U.S. Army. Wounded soldiers from the other units were quickly taken to the Yellowstone River where the steamboat Far West was waiting with supplies. The boat's pilot, Captain Grant Marsh, steamed as fast as he could back to Bismarck. 10 days after the battle, the Far West reached Bismarck, and word quickly spread that over 250 men had lost their lives. Many people criticized Custer for being reckless and leading his troops to death. Libby Custer wanted people to believe that her husband was a brave hero. She spent the next 57 years, until her death at age 91, writing books, articles, and letters defending her husband's memory. Fort Abraham Lincoln remained in operation until 1891. After the fort was abandoned, settlers took apart the buildings and used the lumber to build houses and farm buildings. They also made good use of other items they found. The fancy bathtubs in the officers' quarters made good feeding troughs, for the farmers' pigs. Today, several of the buildings at Fort Abraham Lincoln, including Custer's house, have been reconstructed. The site is located in Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park near Mondon. Fort Yates was established in 1874. Fort Yates was located along the Missouri River near the present-day South Dakota border. Fort Yates closed in 1895 and was turned over to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. The site of the fort is located at the present-day town of Fort Yates, North Dakota. The last Army fort to be built in North Dakota had a similar name to another fort. Fort Lincoln was established in 1896. It was located on the east side of the Missouri River just south of Bismarck. Fort Abraham Lincoln, located on the west side of the river south of Mondon, had already been abandoned when Fort Lincoln was built. Today, the site of Fort Lincoln is owned by the 5 Indian tribes of North Dakota, the Mondon, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, the Spirit Lake Tribe, the Sisseton Wahpeton Sioux Tribe, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, and the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. It is the home of United Tribes Technical College. Many of the brick buildings of the fort, completed in the early 1900s, are still in use.